and thank you for joining today's Market Surveillance Committee General Session meeting. Before we begin, please ensure that you have opened the chat panel by using the associated icon located at the bottom of your screen. If you require any technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. Please note that we will not be taking written questions at this time, and all audio lines have been muted until the Q&A portion of the call. We'll give you instructions on how to ask a question. With that, I'll turn the call over to Dr. Benjamin Hobbs, Chair of the Market Surveillance Committee. Please go ahead.
You're muted, Ben.
It looks like your audio is muted.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, Kara, for being the operator on the call, and thank you everybody for joining us. The purpose of today's call is to consider the adoption of an opinion on the EIM resource efficiency evaluation enhancements. Before we do so, I'd like to introduce who's on the call from the California ISO staff side and from the MSC, and then have open comment, as we always do at the beginning of any of our meetings. We will then summarize the opinion and then leave lots of time for discussion, because there are a lot of pieces to this, and all of them I think are interesting, and I imagine we're going to hear about them. So first of all, on the call, I have with me the other members of the MSC, Jim Bushnell and Scott Harvey. And from the ISO, joining us includes Anna McKenna, Brad Cooper, Greg Cook, Guillermo Bautista Alderete, Shami Davis, and Danny Johnson. I think I've got everybody. Have I forgotten anybody? I think we've got everybody. That's great. Okay, so at this point, I would welcome questions or comments on any market issue. If it's about this opinion, if I could ask that you could hold those comments and questions until after we summarize the opinion. Operator, if you could see if anybody is queued up to make comments or questions about any other issue. So if there's anybody in the audience who has a comment or question at this time.
At this time, there are no questions in the queue.
Okay, thank you. So the summary of the opinion, we're going to divide the duties for that among the three of us. I'll give you a quick introduction and overview, and then I'm going to pass it to Scott Harvey, who's going to talk about two sets of issues. I'll return to talk about another issue, and then Jim Bushnell will close us out. So the opinion concerns the proposed enhancements to the EIM resource efficiency evaluation process, a process which was in response to the events of August 2020, and is a continuation of the ISO's evaluation of the resource efficiency evaluation, EAM, that began with the summer 2021 readiness initiative, which we had a call a few months ago before the summer 2021. So the purpose, as you all know, of the RSE is to evaluate whether each balancing area authority can meet its own net load with its own available resources before allowing it to exchange power through the EIM with other EIAs, with other BAAs. And actually, if you fail either the capacity or the flexible ramping test, what happens is that you can't increase your imports. And those tests are designed to minimize the likelihood of a BAA having to lean on other EIM entities. And that's what we're focusing on this opinion. There are some other pieces to the RSE which we won't talk about here. So the opinion is structured as follows. We first summarize the objectives of the resource efficiency evaluation in section 2, and then in sections 3 through 8, so there's 6 sections, we address 6 sets of issues. First, some statistical issues, which if any of you fondly recall your undergraduate statistics class, you really will enjoy this part. I'll be summarizing a couple of those issues, but prior to doing that, sections 4 and 5 will be discussed by Scott Harvey. In section 4, we address some concerns that the level of EIM transfer imports into the California ISO reflects undue leaning on the pool by the ISO, and that this leaning is somehow facilitated by the use of load conformance adjustments by the operators. So Scott will address that issue, as well as a set of complicated issues in section 5 concerning the interaction of 3 real-time processes: the hour-ahead scheduling process, the 15-minute market or real-time pre-dispatch, and finally the real-time dispatch. And the structure of these, the rules for these are such that they can cause a pretty wild swing in net imports into the California ISO, in part because of what happens to the pricing of flexible ramp product in the rest of the EIM. And I'll let Scott discuss that. So I'll then discuss statistical issues, and then sections 6 through 8, sections 6 and 7 discuss a couple of more focused issues. One is concerns whether and how offline capacity that could be committed in the short-term unit commitment should be counted. There's some technical issues, but there's some broader considerations that have to be balanced. And one is whether capacity that can't come online in time to provide the needed capacity in the period is to make sure that capacity can't come online, is not counted as meeting capacity needs. But on the other hand, we don't want to create a situation where it's efficient to decommit or not commit in the first place capacity ahead of the 15-minute market, and incurring the startup and the PMIN costs. We don't want to give an incentive to do that just in order to not fail the test when that capacity is in fact not actually needed. Section 7 is about the proposed requirement that transmission be tagged at T-40 in order for interbalancing authority transfers to count towards the capacity test. And then finally, Section 8 considers the implications of failures of the resource efficiency evaluation when there are emergency conditions, when somebody is short, or maybe the whole West is short, and the possible consequences for system reliability. And Jim Bushnell will discuss some of the trade-offs there. Basically, we want to encourage participation in the EIM, and we want to wring the most possible reliability and economic efficiency benefits from it. But on the other hand, there's a good reason why we don't want to encourage leaning either, and Jim will discuss that. So at this point, Scott, I'd like to hand it over to you to discuss the issues in sections 4 and 5.
Thanks, Ben. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Scott Harvey. As Ben said, I'm going to talk about 2 of these issues that are they're fairly intertwined in our view. There has been a concern we heard from stakeholders that the use of load conformance by the CAISO enables the CAISO to lean on the pool to meet its flexibility requirement, and a related general concern that the level of CAISO EIM transfer imports suggests that they are driven by more than the intended purpose of just serving economic redispatch. And we discussed this in our opinion. We agree that with the concern that EIM transfer imports can in principle be used to back down generation, thereby enabling a balance area to pass the flexible flexibility evaluation, and we also agree that load conformance adjustments can be one method a balancing area could use to achieve this increased transfers and back down internal generation. However, we also note that it appears to us that a balancing area using EM transfer imports to pass the flexibility evaluation would fail the resource sufficiency capacity evaluation because increasing EIM transfer imports only helps pass the flexibility evaluation if the imports unload capacity needed to pass the flexibility evaluation. The EIM transfer imports would not create any more fast ramping capacity, so the situation in which increasing EIM transfers enables someone to pass the flexibility test looks to us like it's a situation in which they would fail the capacity test as far as we can tell. If there is, however, a concern that the capacity evaluation, that there is some loophole and that the current capacity evaluation does not effectively check this potential impact of EIM transfers, then we take the view that there should be a consideration of modifying the flexibility evaluation to back out the impact of EIM transfer imports and applying the evaluation. We understand that such a change would be complicated, and as we said, it's not clear that this would serve a purpose different than the capacity sufficiency evaluation. But we do take the view that any change should address all methods of increasing EIM transfer imports in order to pass the sufficiency test. These load conformance adjustments that the CAISO makes are not the only way that an EIM can increase EIM transfer imports. Any EIM entity whose base schedules are supported by the EIM entity's generation can achieve the same effect by increasing the offer prices of the resources supporting its base schedules. Hence, we've expressed the view that if there's a need to make changes to the flexibility evaluation to address these issues with potential leaning, these changes should be designed to address all methods balancing areas can use to increase EIM transfers and pass the sufficiency test. Conversely, we observe that a capacity sufficiency evaluation, which includes load conformance adjustments alone and the load used in the capacity evaluation, would not address all the methods EIM entities could use to create transfers to unload capacity, so it would not be a good way to address such a concern. Moreover, we have the view, which has been discussed in several meetings, that such a design would have important adverse reliability and market impacts. Such a design would appear to effectively preclude CAISO operators from using load conformance adjustments in HASP to ensure an adequate supply of deliverable capacity. Given the problems with the current FlexiRoute implementation, operators will be forced to meet these needs with new, even more ad hoc adjustments, which would not be a good outcome from either a reliability standpoint or from the standpoint of market signals. Moreover, such a design would exacerbate the impact of current inconsistencies between the HASP evaluation and the resource sufficiency evaluations that we'll discuss in a few minutes, creating even further problems. Hence, we support the ISO's decision to not include load conformance adjustments in the resource sufficiency capacity evaluations, and we don't see the need for changes to the flexibility test, but if stakeholders identify additional concerns, we would support a general solution. Beyond the narrow focus on load conformance adjustments, however, we also follow the broader stakeholder concerns with the level of EIM transfers, particularly the example pointed to of the level of EIM transfers on July 9 and reviewed in detail the data for that day. In that review, we observed that while the price of FlexiRamp in the 15-minute market for the CAISO was often substantial, ranging from $50 to $247, the price in FlexiRamp was typically zero in the 15-minute market for the EIM region, and zero for every EIM entity except those whose transfers were frozen as a result of failing a sufficiency evaluation. We further observe that this large discrepancy in the shadow price of ramp capacity between the CAISO and the rest of the EIM would cause the economic dispatch both in HASP and the 15 market to increase EIM transfers into the CAISO based on these economic factors, perhaps substantially, because the cost of CAISO generation will be increased by amounts ranging from $50 to $247 a megawatt as a result of the trade-off with the CAISO FlexiRamp requirement, which was binding, compared to the zero cost of dispatching generation outside the CAISO that similarly reduces the available FlexiRamp. In going further and reviewing the DMM data in their quarterly reports, we observed this pattern of high CAISO FlexiRamp prices and zero EIM FlexiRamp prices in the 15-minute market was not limited to July 9, but appears to have occurred whenever the CAISO locational requirement bound and the CAISO is short of FlexiRamp capacity in HASP or the 15-minute market engine. It is difficult to disentangle the effect of load conformance adjustments and FlexiRamp pricing and how they may interact. But the zero price of FlexiRamp in the EIM region would tend to increase the amount of load conformance met with EIM transfers because it would make them appear cheaper and would tend to result in a higher level of observed transfers in 2021 when the floor was in effect compared to 2020 before the implementation. This observation of this problem led us to ask a further question of why the EIM price was zero on days like July 9 when the system was very short of capacity. And we initially thought that the zero price of FlexiRamp for EIM entities on July 9 was due to bottled FlexiRamp in the Pacific Northwest, which you can see was constrained down relative to the rest of the EIM energy dispatch. However, we also asked the CAISO some questions about the anomalous EIM FlexiRamp prices, and the CAISO investigated these anomalies and discussed their initial findings with the CAISO last week. These initial findings indicate that there are two other features of how EIM FlexiRamp prices are calculated that contributed to the zero price of FlexiRamp on these days and had the effect that the EIM FlexiRamp price was set at zero, even when materially less than target level of FlexiRamp was procured across the EIM. We did not go into the details of these issues in our opinion, and we're not going to talk about them today, but we think it's important for the CAISO to discuss these FlexiRamp pricing issues with EIM stakeholders in the near term. We also, however, noted that it's possible that even if these pricing issues were corrected, the price of FlexiRamp would still have been set at zero across the EIM on July 9 because the full requirement could have been potentially met with unloaded bottled capacity in the constrained down region of the Pacific Northwest. So this, when we see these different prices, we need to address all the reasons for these discrepancies, which makes it important to understand if the nodal design that the CAISO is developing to address these deliverability issues is on track for implementation in fall 2023, and how well it would be performed, and how well it will be performed not just for the CAISO, but also for other balancing areas and groups of balancing areas within the EIM. So hence, in our opinion, on the one hand, we don't feel it's appropriate to make changes to the capacity test to include load conformance adjustments, but we do feel there are issues relating to the level of EIM transfers and FlexiRamp pricing that the CAISO needs to discuss with stakeholders. I'm now going to shift gears slightly and talk about the fifth issue, but the fifth issue is somewhat intertwined. A number of concerns have been expressed over the past several months by stakeholders regarding the impact of discrepancies between the constraints that are enforced in HASP and the 15 market and the constraints applied and tests applied in the resource sufficiency evaluation. And it's been discussed that these discrepancies have the potential to cause the CAISO to fail the resource sufficiency test when it does not need to, because HASP would fail to schedule hourly imports that it could have scheduled, and also that could fail the resource sufficiency capacity evaluation when it had enough resources because of HASP scheduling hourly exports that would be effectively supported by EIM transfers. Now, in thinking about these issues are intertwined with the considerations we just discussed because the low prices of FlexiRamp and the rest of the EIM and the artificially low price of imports in the EIM creates a reason for the HASP evaluation to tend to schedule EIM transfers. At present, it's our assessment and in discussions with the CAISO, we conclude that the potential for the CAISO to fail the resource sufficiency test as a result of these inconsistencies is held in check by the large level of load conformance adjustments in HASP, which have the effect of causing the CAISO to schedule more capacity than is needed to meet their load and enough to meet the capacity evaluation. We don't think this is a good long-run design and for the EIM, and it probably raises costs for CAISO consumers. This issue, and so I know that this is related to the price of FlexiRamp because of The pricing, and one way to address these inconsistencies would be to include the resource sufficiency constraints in the HASP and 15-minute market, but as has been discussed with stakeholders in the past several months, that would have adverse impacts on pricing between the HASP and the 15-minute market, and the issues with 15-minute pricing that we just discussed would exacerbate these impacts. So this is something we feel needs to be discussed. Another inconsistency between these processes and the resource sufficiency evaluation that has not been discussed is one that may exist in RTD and may have had some impact on EIM entities other than the CAISO. We discussed in the report how we saw some anomalies in the DMM data relating to failures of the test due to flexibility and capacity, and considered how these patterns could have come to exist. And one factor that we recognized in evaluating this is that while balancing areas that are dispatched to provide exports receive a credit in the flexibility evaluation for those exports, there's no constraint in RTD to ensure that resources that are economically dispatched within a balancing area to maintain unloaded rampable capacity within that balancing area to pass the flexibility evaluation. Hence, a possible outcome in the current RTD implementation could be that low-cost capacity in an EIM entity could be dispatched up close to its upper limit instead of dispatching up slightly higher cost slow ramping capacity, leaving too little ramping capacity available within the 15 minutes to pass the flexibility test, even though the balancing area actually had enough capacity to make that test had it been dispatched appropriately. But again, there's this inconsistency between the structure of RTD and the test that RTD wouldn't necessarily have that effect. Now, this again is intertwined with the discussion of pricing, because if the price of FlexiRamp and RTD reflected the need for FlexiRamp within the constrained region of the CAISO, the RTD dispatch should dispatch resources to maintain flexible capacity. But of course, it wouldn't necessarily maintain that within an individual balancing area, which therefore could fail the test. And we're offered, tying back to the discussion we just had, since the price of FlexiRamp is uniformly zero in RTD, except for entities failing the balancing test, RTD will not see the need to maintain ramp and FlexiRamp in RTD because the price is zero, and therefore there's no value to that redispatch. So given the light of these concerns, we share the view of stakeholders that the CAISO should begin to discuss the impact of these inconsistencies and perhaps make some data available so market participants can assess the urgency of making changes in the current mechanism. While the CAISO can address these and perhaps the issues with the capacity test with its load balance of conformance adjustments, that isn't a good long-run solution. So that wraps up my comments on those two issues, Ben.
Thank you, Scott. See, everybody can still hear me, right?
I can hear you, Ben.
Okay, that's great. Okay, I'd like to briefly touch on the statistical issues raised in Section 3, and I'll be relatively brief on this. So first of all, Section 3.1, we give some background on two issues that we think that the resource sufficiency evaluation should try to better deal with. I mean, they're fundamentally very difficult statistical issues. They can't be completely overcome, but we think that they can be better dealt with. So one of them is that the present look-back methods result in an effectively very small sample size to estimate the tail of the distributions, the extreme events that we're concerned with in the capacity and flexibility tests. And the small sample happens for several reasons. One is that looking back only a few weeks because we want to avoid bias. If you look back a lot of weeks, then you're bringing in periods of time that are very different than the present month. The you can get more points by considering multiple intervals within the same day, but the problem is that the high correlations in the errors among intervals in the same day mean that you're really not adding a lot of degrees of freedom when you're doing a statistical test, when you're trying to estimate the tails. And so this problem, as DMM has pointed out, manifests itself in relative instability of the requirements that need to be met in terms of the parameters of the tests. And this is a problem if, first of all, the instability results in, very frequently anomalously high values, which really are overly stringent relative to what we're trying to accomplish with the test, prevent leaning. And secondly, the volatility in these resulting from the small samples, that as you drop a day and add a day, that suddenly the test thresholds change quite a bit. They may change with too short of a notice for the BAAs to actually do something about getting capacity. So if the test threshold suddenly jumps up from one day to the next, then there may be some scurrying around to try to get the additional capacity that's supposedly needed, and that could result in the failure of the test if you can't get them. So we suggest some ways that perhaps more stable estimates could be applied, recognizing that you're not going to be, if you're after the 2.5 and the 97.5% percentiles, that really, if you don't look back more than 40 days, there's really nothing fundamentally you can do to increase the sample size. We talk about perhaps longer samples with smaller weights on more distant times, or looking at the previous year, although as we know, the amount of, for example, behind the meter solar is changing a lot from year to year. It's a difficult problem, but we suggest some things that might be done. And certainly it's important to communicate, as DMM has tried to do, the stability of the test requirements, and to flag values that might be considered anomalous. We realize that not everybody will agree what an anomalous value is, but you could have perhaps more than one definition and show what happens when you apply those. Anomalous ones may be very high or very low values, and also large changes from day to day. The second statistical issue is that the current methodology adds the uncertainty requirement for net load uncertainty to the uncertainty requirement for the intertide deviation in the capacity test. And adding uncertainties, like adding standard deviations, is perfectly fine if the two uncertainties are perfectly correlated or very highly correlated. We haven't seen data that indicates whether or not this is the case. This is certainly something that could be investigated. And there are statistical methods to correctly add up the uncertainties if they are somewhat but not perfectly correlated, or even if they are uncorrelated. But generally, just simply adding the uncertainties is going to result in much more conservative, that is, a more difficult to pass test than if you treat them correctly. And we're looking forward to seeing data on these correlations and understanding how more accurate estimates of what the joint uncertainty together produces, what more accurate estimates of the test might look like. So in response to some of these issues, the ISO has proposed in an interim period to no longer include either net load uncertainty requirements or intertide deviation uncertainty requirements in the resource efficiency capacity test, but to continue the flexibility test as it is, which only involves one of them, the load uncertainty requirement. That's fine, although we're concerned that the interim period may be a long time, because this is an interim until an improved statistical method called quantile regression has been implemented, tested. The reason we're concerned, we've had some experience ourselves using quantile regression, and so quantile regression by itself cannot solve the small sample problem. The estimates of the 97.5th percentile will still be unstable. There are some ways to perhaps add some stability, which we talk about in here, and I think you would have to have, statistics would have had to have been your favorite course as an undergraduate for you to really enjoy those parts of the opinion. But at any rate, we have some suggestions in there, but there is a possibility that the quantile regression method will not really help with the statistical issue of the small sample. It, of course, doesn't address the problem that you have of adding two uncertainties together. What the quantile regression can do, which I think is very valuable, is that it can allow the risks to reflect the conditions of the day if some of the explanatory variables in the quantile regression reflect the meteorology of the day or other system conditions that could affect the degree of uncertainty. Although my experience is that the more variables you add to quantile regression, again, the less stable the estimates of the tail are. So we're looking forward to hearing more about how the quantile regression methodology is working. There have been some general descriptions of the methodology and some selected results that were presented, for example, last week by Guillermo, and I think it's very helpful. But we're actually we suspect that most stakeholders don't fully appreciate what's at stake here and the difficulties that might be encountered with quantile regression. And so we're looking forward to more thorough documentation of the results in an evaluation to say whether see whether in fact they provide more stable and dependable estimates of the thresholds that need to be met in the tests. So that concludes my discussion of the statistical issues, and so I'd like to pass it on to Dr. Jim Bushnell, who will close us out.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So yeah, I'm going to try to take the discussion from trees to a little forest at this point and kind of tie together some of the points Scott and Ben have been trying to make. I tried to approach a lot of the questions here from the standpoint of what are the costs of false positives versus false negatives, and you could define them one way or the other. Let's just call false positives as passing the RSE when you shouldn't have, and a false negative as failing when you actually should have passed. This is sort of related with another question I struggled with during this whole thing, which was really what the definition of leaning is, and I annoyed my colleagues with asking this over and over, because in trying to kind of get to the root of that, I think what it really highlights is that the RSE fails to really make a distinction between two dramatically different situations. One in which there is a balancing authority that's a little short, or more than a little short of one of these criterion, but the system as a whole has plenty of resources and it's efficient to sell them to that short region in the most efficient way possible, which in many cases is via the EAIM optimization. And the other situation is a case where the system as a whole, or pockets of the system, more than just one BAA, are actually short, and or the BAAs that are passing don't have any excess to sell to the BAA that's failing, is another way to think about it. And that's kind of the situation that that's commonly associated with the term leaning. Although, with the EIM, what I struggled with is in the EIM, there's somebody buying and selling the power to them. And if there is excess power to sell, then you certainly wouldn't want to cut off a transfer of power to the BAA that's short if it's not hurting the reliability of the other BAAs to do so. And, you know, the risk of this test is that by capping transfers, it could actually do that in a period where there's one BAA that really needs more transfers, and it just didn't pass this test for one reason or another. It might be negligence or it might just be bad luck. And so I looked at it, I tried to look at it from that way, and it really sort of highlights some of the issues Ben was talking about statistically in terms of, are you trying to get really a precise estimate of what's going on right now to know whether in the next 5 or 15 minutes this BAA has what it needs, or are you trying to do something with a bit more of a longer run perspective to try to more capture the question of, did this BAA behave responsibly going into those 15-minute or 5-minute periods? And I do think something that's a bit more stable of an approximation of needs rather than trying to micro-fit closely to the conditions of the moment captures the spirit of this sort of, you know, did they behave responsibly under reasonable expectations kind of standard, although, you know, I admit there's definitely rooms for debate with that. You know, a lot of these issues are things that I think are really ripe for discussion in this Phase 1B when we talk about what the appropriate penalty is and how to think about those sorts of questions. Okay, so that's one aspect of this, which is the lack of distinction between sort of a regional shortfall kind of issue and a single failure where the EIM is really well positioned to actually solve that problem. The second issue that's related to it that came up throughout the discussion has been this interaction between the operation of markets that are not the EIM or kind of arbitrarily distinguished as not part of the EIM, where HASP is sort of in this gray area, where decisions made for optimal cost minimization in these periods leading up to the EIM can cause a BAA to fail, even though, you know, again, the idea of did they behave responsibly from a longer run perspective, they pass that sort of that perspective of a test, but we just chose not to use certain types of resources as part of the optimal dispatch going into that 15-minute period. And that's where a lot of these issues having to do with the HASP and arguably even load convergence, which is not necessarily missing a load forecast, but more kind of actually doing things to try to line up stuff outside of EIM in a way that lead to this sort of question of, all right, how much are we worried about transfers that are lined up in EIM versus transfers that are lined up, say, an hour before EIM. There's important kind of organizational, institutional distinctions between the two, but when you sort of take the electrical perspective of the transfers that happen an hour and 45 minutes before versus those that are happening through the optimization of the EIM, do they have a lot of meaningful distinctions in terms of the advanced arrangements made by different BAAs? And I think some of the issues that have been raised in terms of the RTD operations, the HASP issue, you know, sort of fall in that category of how should we kind of think about arrangements that are made on the day of but are not officially part of the EIM, and do those rise to the same standard of concern as some of the other issues that the RSE was meant to really try to target? So I'll stop there. I think that, like I said, these are issues that I think we should consider when we start focusing on the longer run design questions and whether there's some kind of financial penalty that might complement or substitute for the physical capping issue, and whether there's some way to really more formally make a distinction between the regional shortfall kind of situation where leaning is really the reliability concern and the other sorts of issues where it is sort of, oh, you know, you're buying an EIM, but we really wanted you to buy it a couple hours earlier, which do seem to be dramatically different situations. All right, so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jim. So at this point, we would welcome comments and questions from the audience. I saw a couple in the chat, and I'm sorry that we can't answer or address those, but maybe those the folks who talked in the chat would be willing to get in line and speak up through the phone lines. So, Kara, is there anybody on the phone lines who would like to ask a question or make a comment?
Yes, there are people with their hands raised in the queue. Let's go to Michelle.
Hey, this is Michelle Keto with the CPUC. Hey, I first wanted to ask about the failing the EIM resource sufficiency test when you hit an EEA3. And I would just look over the last year, and the only time that CAISO had an EEA3 was the loss of the catastrophic transmission failure due to the bootleg fire, and also because the penalty parameters on the transmission on the imports were incorrectly, were not set to foreclose the imports, so we continued to support the exports. So I just wonder about your thoughts about imposing resource sufficiency when the only example we have seems to be one of those anomalous situations as opposed to this idea of leaning.
It would be interesting, I suppose, to know what's happened over several years, whether, this is typical that it's only something quite, something unusual rather than basic resource inadequacy in the short run. I don't know if anybody from the ISO would have, some longer experience to base an answer on.
Sure, Ben. This is Danny Johnson with the ISO. I think, Michelle, getting to your question, we want and we view this aspect of the proposal as a backstop to ensure that the RSC isn't erroneously giving passes during clear instances of resource insufficiency. So for that reason, we're looking to use the NERC EEAs as a benchmark of what constitutes resource insufficiency. I think that right now, to the ISO at least, an EEA3 makes sense. Some stakeholders have advocated for an EEA2, and that is a point that I think that we're still actively considering.
You're still considering the EEA2?
I don't believe it is settled at this moment.
Okay, I mean, I wonder why we do this anyway. We haven't done it for the last 3 years. We're coming upon a summer. We've just identified lots of uncertainties with regard to the insufficiency or the sufficiency test, and given those uncertainties, to add this additional, kind of very dramatic, potentially dramatic issue if it's because of, anomalous situations. Okay, that's my first question.
I think, can I respond to that real quick, Michelle? I think the reason we're doing it is the events that we saw in August 2020, right? Like CAISO and some of those intervals had actually shed firm load and was still passing the RSE. So that's the type of outcome that we want this backstop to prevent reoccurring.
Right, but then we also know that in the August events, we were using the price run rather than the scheduling run, and so we were supporting exports that we knew were infeasible. So again, to me, that's another example of an anomalous situation.
Yeah, this is Scott Harvey. We're trying to create those anomalous situations, but we still have the situation that could exist in the future of the CAISO using load to meet its spinning reserve requirement and then converting its non-spin reserves into energy, so that the CAISO would be substantially short of capacity, but it would pass the sufficiency test because the counting the load as 10-minute reserves would enable it to meet its reserve requirement and make all this capacity available. So I thought there were these clear situations which neither the CAISO nor another balancing area should be able to say, oh, we're just fine, when in fact they're counting load to meet their requirements.
Yeah, and I think this was getting to Jim Bushnell's point, though, about whether, these transitory anomalous situations that are serious are what we're aiming at when we're doing resource efficiency. So that's just that comment. So my other comment or question is about the T-40. And I'm struggling with the idea that in the HASP process, all the imports clear and they allow exports out of CAISO to be supported. But in the RSE, we're going to cut the HASP, we're going to cut those imports if they don't tag at T-40. And it strikes me as odd that in one circumstance, you'll use it to support the exports, but then in the other circumstance, we're going to use it to potentially fail the RSE. I understand why we would fail the RSE, but then I question why we allow the imports that we know are going to have a certain amount of failure support exports that then become firm after the HASP process.
Ben, would you like me to respond?
Sure, please.
Yeah, I think, Michelle, again, you've identified a issue which we agree is an issue which we plan to address in phase 1B, which I think we're kicking off later this month. Understanding that's an issue, I still think from an RSE counting perspective, it would be unreasonable to count supply that we don't have any confidence in showing up and have zeroed out in the FMM.
I guess my point is that the exports, we're willing to count the full exports, right? Even though the import portion of it, which might be supported by HASP or might be supported by EIM advisory imports, is not there, right?
Correct. And that's the issue that we're looking to resolve on as expedited a timeline as we can.
Right, but it's going to exacerbate the problem. So if, for example, we have EIM advisory imports supporting the exports, we're already at a disadvantage. If you look at the data you showed for July 9th, that was on the order of 2,000 megawatts. You add the T-40 failure, where we're going to be supporting the exports that are potentially based on those failed imports, that's only going to exacerbate the problem, right?
Yeah, I think to the extent that those exports would be cut and the imports would be cut and the exports would still be shown as obligations, it would increase the likelihood for the CAISO to fail the RSE, which is, again, why we're trying to address this in as expedited of a manner as possible. I think the converse of saying we should count supply that we know is not going to show up and we don't have any confidence in wouldn't be something that we think makes the RSE more accurate.
Okay. And I tend to agree with you, but I would note that there was sort of a disparate treatment here. So we're going to apply it to the CAISO, but knowing that this is similar to the intertie uncertainty, we're taking off the intertie uncertainty on the other EIM entities, but we're not taking it off on CAISO.
The intertie uncertainty adder, I believe it will be removed for all participants in the capacity test.
Right. But if you read the MSC report says that they're duplicative, right? That the T-40 and the intertie uncertainty are duplicative, so you can do one or the other. But here we're going to do one for the CAISO, but we're not doing it for the EIM entities.
I think we are, Michelle. I think the T-40 tagging rule applies to everyone.
I mean, if it's in their base schedule, they don't, I mean, there's no T-, I mean, well, maybe Danny can explain. Is this applicable to everyone, Danny?
The T-40 tagging would be applicable to the CAISO.
Right.
Really? Why would other people have to tag something to count?
And I think you're raising a valid question, Scott, but right now we don't validate tags between separate EIM BAAs.
Well, I didn't understand
that. Okay, that's my second point. My third point is you guys have identified a number of issues with the FlexiRamp product as well as the uncertainty calculation, the day-ahead uncertainty calculation. And I'm wondering, do these need to be resolved, or these are embedded issues when we think about the day-ahead market changes that we're trying to implement, which are going to be calculating even larger uncertainties?
In terms of the statistical issues, Michelle, I think they're the small sample issues, and if you're adding uncertainties together, that the same questions would apply. And and some of the possible, not fixes, but improvements might be, if useful to one, might be useful to the other.
Okay, and then I would just also note with regard to the flexible ramping product and the quartile regression, that's not going to be implemented until fall of 2023. So we won't even have, the assessment, let alone the results. Is that right?
There wouldn't be an assessment of how it actually works in practice until after that. The sort of simulations that the ISO does will hopefully provide, give us some idea of its potential performance well before then, before we finalize that. But the results that were shown last week at the EDAM meeting, I think, are start in that direction, and we're looking forward to a lot more assessments.
Okay, thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Okay, Michelle, thank you. Kara, is there anybody else on the phone line?
Yes, moving to the last person in the queue. Dan, your line is unmuted.
All right, thank you, Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. Thank you for the in-depth presentation and run through on this. I mean, there's a lot to digest here, including in the written opinion. I had a couple questions, but just given the time, I think I'll just kind of turn it into a comment, and we can follow up somewhere down the road, I guess, if needed. The first was just in relation to something that Dr. Harvey said about how potentially inflated prices for EIM base schedules could effectively do the same thing as load conformance as far as increasing EIM transfers. And I'm just not tracking with that. The base schedules represent real capacity regardless their price. So I would kind of, maybe you went into that more in the opinion and I just didn't track it, but that's something I'd like to hear some more discussion around when we get there, probably in the initiative. The other thing was just kind of hoping for some commentary from the MSC on just how big of an issue this all is, kind of from a perspective of dollars at risk in settlements or even reliability when we're talking about the pricing inaccuracies that you brought up and other problems with the RSC in the EIM, and what that should tell us about how big of a priority this should be in the stakeholder process. But I guess just hearing from Danny and your response to Michelle that CAISO is planning on taking up a phase 1B later this month, that maybe we're making it that priority regardless. So just some comments. There's a couple minutes left if you want to respond to any of that, but I understand if we're out of time.
Thanks, Dan. Scott, would you like to talk about the point about high prices in the base schedule that Dan was asking about?
Sure, Dan. The base schedule is just a schedule of physical resources, but the sufficiency test issue the market participants raised is whether you can use EIM imports to unload your resources in order to create additional flexible capacity, passing the flexibility capacity test. And that, could be done just as the CAISO could potentially, or any other balancing area could use load conformance adjustments to increase their EIM transfer imports and therefore unload capacity to create additional ramp. So could any entity unload their capacity, know they would unload their capacity by increasing their offer prices so that there would be more EIM transfer imports, which would, of course, unload the high offer price capacity.
Which could be the efficient thing to do.
Right. And
but yeah, that's sort of the dichotomy here.
This is the flexibility test too. We were talking about, not right. The capacity test.
Yeah, and then I'll just say on your second point about like the cost impacts and so forth, I think, as far as the RSC specifically goes, you've got this issue of capping, tie transfers, and that's, a potential reliability issue, but again, it depends on the situation in which it's applied, but it does seem kind of perverse to basically cut off imports into an area that is short of capacity if it's not hurting the other parties at the same time. The problem is we don't really have at least a workable way of trying to make a distinction between those periods, I guess. The other thing I'll add quickly, though, is, I think a lot of the discussion that we raise in this paper is less about the RSC and more about things that impact the RSC that are problems in and of themselves. And I think there's an attempt here to try to raise the salience of particularly the flexi-ramp issue, which, affects things way beyond just the RSE. And so when you want to talk about economic impacts, pricing impacts, I think, that is something that we would like to see maybe a bit more, focus on, urgency too, that does affect a lot of things, but it's really not limited to just an RSE issue.
Okay, thank you, Jim. It is the top of the hour, so I would like to proceed to the vote. And my apologies to anybody who's still waiting on the phone line to make a comment or a question. You can always email us, and we can engage in discussions. We will also, on February 11th, we have an what would have normally been an in-person MSC meeting, but of course it will be online. And during that MSC meeting, there will be, as always, a period, an open question and comment period at the beginning. So, so if you have an issue you'd like to discuss, there will be an opportunity a week from Friday to do that. So at this point in time, I would like to entertain a motion to adopt the opinion.
Ben, this is Scott. Did you want to make any kind of motion to correct the numerical issue that DMM pointed out?
Let's do that as an amendment. Let's first see if we've got support for the opinion as a whole, and then then if you want to make a motion to make a correction to that, I'd be very happy to entertain that then. So I think that's the proper order. Anybody else know Robert's Rules of Order?
That's fine with me. Then I vote yes.
Either way. Okay, so I move to adopt the opinion before we amend it.
Jim's moved. Okay, we have a motion's been seconded. So at this point, we can have discussion or amendments. And Scott, I invite you. There's a correction.
Yeah, I think we discussed making a correction to the 480 data points is 320, and the 240 is 160 for weekends.
Okay. To 160. Does any of the staff want to make a final comment on that? This is on what page, by the way? There's a footnote on page 6, and then on page 7, 480 is mentioned 3 times. So 480 is mentioned 3 times, and in every case that should be 320. Is my characterization of that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And 240 is mentioned on page 7 and on page 6 twice. And so likewise, that should be changed.
Correct.
Okay. This is not the business practice manual itself. So if we still have it wrong after that, it's not a disaster. So I don't. If there's no objection, I guess Jim, you motioned to accept this. Would you accept that? These changes?
I move to accept the changes. I also vote yes to accept the changes. I'm not sure which you're asking.
Okay. If there's no objection, I think we can just accept them. We don't have to be that
Let's
formal.
do that. Yeah.
Okay. I have no objection either. So Scott, Jim, and I agree that those changes should be made. Okay. Any other discussion or changes?
Nope.
Okay. I think then we're ready for a vote. And so Scott?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
And I also vote yes. So the opinion with the numerical changes just described has been adopted unanimously. And we're done at this point. So I welcome you all to join us a week from this Friday, where we have, of course, as always, several very important and interesting issues to talk about. And I look forward to interacting all with you. So I wish you a good remainder of the week, and see you next week. Kara, we're all done, so we can end the call.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.